The wind came first, low and cruel, dragging its fingers across the Wyoming plains as if searching for something already lost. And it found a woman on her knees beside a broken trail, her breath tearing from her chest in short, panicked sobs that vanished into the sky before anyone could hear them. Her name no longer mattered to the land. She had walked too far, bled too much, buried too many hopes beneath these endless miles for the prairie to remember it. What it remembered was the way she tried to stand and failed, the way her legs buckled beneath her as though the bones themselves had finally surrendered. The hem of her dress was caked with mud and old blood, stiff from nights slept on frozen ground, and her hands shook so badly she could barely press them into the dirt to keep herself upright. Somewhere behind her, a small voice cracked through the wind like a fragile bell. "Mama?" It wasn't loud. It wasn't demanding. It was the sound of a child already learning that hope had to be spoken softly or it would break. The boy stood a few paces back, thin as a fence rail, his boots worn down at the toes, his coat far too big for him but far too small for the cold. His hair was the color of sun-dried wheat, tangled and matted from days without water, and his eyes, those eyes were too old for his face. He had learned how to watch the horizon the way grown men did, how to measure distance and danger, how to stay quiet when quiet meant survival. He took a step toward her, then another, afraid that if he moved too fast she might disappear altogether, like so many things already had. When he knelt beside her, she tried to smile, tried to lift her head, but the effort sent a sharp, white-hot pain through her back, and she cried out despite herself. The sound tore something open in him. He placed his small hand on her shoulder, feeling how hot she was beneath the thin fabric, how her body trembled as though fever and fear were locked in battle inside her. "Mama can't walk anymore," he whispered. Not to her, but to the empty land around them, as if the plains themselves might answer. They had been walking for 3 days since the wagon finally gave up, its axle snapping like a gunshot in the night, spilling their few remaining possessions into the dust. There had been no one to help them then, just the endless road stretching forward and backward, offering no difference between past and future. She had told him they would rest just for a little while. She had told him she would be fine. Mothers always did. But by the second morning her steps had grown uneven, her breathing shallow, and by the third afternoon she could barely stand at all. The boy remembered the way she used to carry him when he was younger, how safe the world felt from her arms, and the thought pressed down on his chest until it hurt to breathe. Now she was the one falling, and he had nothing strong enough to hold her up. The sun dipped lower, turning the sky the color of rusted iron, and with it came the cold, sharp, and unforgiving. The woman knew what night meant out here. She had seen it claim men stronger than she was, had watched children go still in their sleep when warmth ran out. She pulled the boy closer, wrapping her arms around him with what little strength she had left, her lips brushing his hair as she whispered prayers she wasn't sure anyone was listening to anymore. Her thoughts drifted to a cabin she had once known, to laughter around a table, to a man whose face she could barely remember now except for the way his absence felt, heavier than death itself. She wondered if this was where the road ended, if this stretch of dirt would be the place her boy learned what it meant to be alone. The thought broke her harder than the pain in her legs. That was when the sound reached them, slow, steady, unmistakable hooves, not the frantic thunder of a stampede or the distant echo of a passing herd, but the measured rhythm of a single horse moving with purpose. The boy's head snapped up, his body going rigid as fear and hope collided inside him. He scanned the horizon, shielding his eyes with his hand until he saw it, a dark shape against the fading light, growing clearer with every heartbeat. A horse, and on it a man. The woman felt it too, the shift in the air, the way the silence seemed to hold its breath. She forced herself to sit up, pain screaming through her spine, her heart hammering with a terror she couldn't name. Out here, strangers were not always saviors. Sometimes they were worse than the emptiness. The cowboy reined in his horse a short distance away, close enough to see the lines etched into the woman's face, the hollow look in the boy's eyes, far enough to give them space. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his coat worn and dust-stained, a rifle slung across his back and a revolver resting easy at his side. His face was weathered, the kind of face carved by sun and wind and things left unspoken. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at them, really looked as if taking stock of every detail mattered. The boy tightened his grip on his mother's arm, bracing himself. The woman met the man's gaze, lifting her chin despite the fear curling in her stomach. She would not beg, not yet. Finally, the cowboy swung down from his horse, his boots hitting the ground with a dull thud. He raised his hand slightly, a wordless gesture meant to calm, and took a few slow steps closer. "Evenin'," he said, his voice low and rough like gravel smoothed by water. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't unkind. It simply was. His eyes flicked to the woman's legs, to the way she sat twisted awkwardly, then to the boy, who stared back at him with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope. The cowboy crouched down to their level, ignoring the ache in his own knees, and the boy noticed something then, a scar along the man's jaw, pale and jagged, the mark of a life that hadn't been gentle. For reasons he couldn't explain, that scar made him trust the man more. "She's hurt," the boy said before he could stop himself, his voice trembling despite his effort to keep it steady. He swallowed and added softer now, "Mama can't walk anymore." The words hung between them, fragile and exposed. The cowboy didn't look away. He nodded once, slowly, as if the statement carried weight that needed acknowledging. He turned his attention to the woman, his gaze sharp but not cold. "How long since you last rested?" he asked. She tried to answer, but the dizziness washed over her again, darkening the edges of her vision. The world tilted, and for a terrifying moment she thought she might lose consciousness entirely. The cowboy moved quickly then, closing the distance, steadying her with a firm hand on her shoulder. His touch was careful, respectful, like someone who understood how easily strength could turn into harm. "I ain't asking you to trust me," he said quietly, reading the fear in her eyes. "But you won't last the night out here. Neither of you will." He glanced at the sky, already deepening into indigo, then back at them. The boy felt his heart pounding so hard he was sure the man could hear it. He searched the cowboy's face for lies, for cruelty, for anything that would tell him to run. He found none, only something heavy and tired, like a man who had seen too much loss to add to it lightly. The cowboy straightened and gestured toward his horse. "I got a cabin a few miles west, fire, food, dry roof. That's all I'm offering." The woman closed her eyes, tears leaking out despite her best efforts. She had promised herself she would survive on her own, that she wouldn't owe her life or her child's to another man. But the pain in her body, the weakness creeping through her limbs, the cold settling into her bones all whispered the same truth. Pride would kill them faster than anything else. She looked at her son, at the way he watched her, waiting for her decision, trusting her to choose right. Her voice broke when she finally spoke. "Please," she said, the word barely audible. "He's all I have." The cowboy nodded again, as if that settled something inside him. Without another word, he shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders, the fabric heavy and warm, smelling of leather and smoke. Then gently, with a care that surprised them both, he lifted the woman into his arms as though she weighed nothing at all. As the horse began the slow journey west, the boy clung to the cowboy's coat, his face pressed against his mother's chest, listening to her breathing, feeling the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them. The cabin was still unseen, just a promise hanging in the dark. But for the first time in days, hope flickered to life, not bright, not certain, but real. And behind them, the plains swallowed their footprints without a trace, as if erasing the moment they almost didn't survive. The ride stretched on longer than the boy expected, the world reduced to the slow sway of the horse and the sound of its breathing. Steady and patient, as if it understood the importance of every careful step. The cowboy kept one arm locked around the woman's back, strong and unmoving, while the other held the reins loose enough to let the horse find its way through the dark. The woman drifted in and out of awareness, the pain in her body dulling and sharpening in waves, her cheek pressed against the rough wool of the man's shirt. She could feel his heartbeat, slow and even, and it grounded her in a way she hadn't felt since before the road took everything from her. Each time her head lolled, he adjusted his grip without a word, as though he had carried burdens like this before and learned how to do it without complaint. The boy sat in front of them, the borrowed coat swallowing him whole, its sleeves hanging past his hands. He held onto the saddle horn with both fists, knuckles white, afraid that if he let go even for a moment, the night might snatch them back. His eyes darted constantly, scanning the shadows for movement, listening for sounds that didn't belong to the horse or the man guiding it. Wolves, bandits, men worse than wolves. His mind supplied dangers faster than the darkness could hide them. Yet the cowboy never tensed, never reached for his gun, and that calm slowly began to seep into the boy's bones. He found himself matching his breathing to the horse's steps, letting the rhythm carry him forward. When the cabin finally appeared, it was nothing more than a low shape against the darker line of trees, a faint glow leaking from a single window. To the boy, it looked like a miracle. The cowboy guided the horse to a stop and swung down first, then helped the boy dismount, setting him gently on the ground before turning back to the woman. She stirred as he lifted her again, her eyes fluttering open. The smell of wood smoke reached her, sharp and comforting, and she let out a weak, broken laugh that turned into a cough. "You made it," the cowboy said softly, as if speaking to someone he'd been waiting on. He carried her to the door and pushed it open with his shoulder, letting warmth spill out into the cold night like a living thing. Inside, the cabin was small but orderly, the kind of place built by hands that valued function over comfort but understood the importance of both. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting light across a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed tucked against the far wall. The cowboy laid the woman down on the bed with care, easing her legs straight and sliding a folded blanket beneath her knees. She hissed through her teeth as pain flared, but it passed quickly, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that left her limbs heavy and unresponsive. The boy hovered near the door, unsure where to stand, his eyes wide as he took in the sight of 4 solid walls and a roof that didn't threaten to collapse. The cowboy noticed and nodded toward a chair. "Sit," he said. "You're safe here." Safe. The word felt strange, almost dangerous, but the boy obeyed, sinking into the chair as though his body had been waiting for permission to rest. His legs trembled now that the need to keep moving was gone, and he wrapped the coat tighter around himself, breathing in its scent. The cowboy moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, pouring water from a kettle into a tin cup, adding something dark from a small jar, and holding it to the woman's lips. "Drink," he murmured. "Slow." She did, each swallow a small victory, the warmth spreading through her chest and easing the tightness there. She studied his face between sips, noting the way his jaw clenched when she winced, the way his eyes never left her until he was sure she could manage on her own. Once she was settled, the cowboy turned his attention to the boy, setting a plate of bread and a small pot of beans on the table. The smell made the child's stomach twist painfully, and only then did he realize how hungry he was. He hesitated, glancing at his mother. She gave him a weak nod. "Eat," she whispered. "Please." He didn't need to be told twice. He ate with the careful intensity of someone who knew food could vanish at any moment, savoring each bite even as he tried to make it last. The cowboy watched him from across the room, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, saying nothing. There was something in his gaze, recognition. Maybe. That made the boy slow down, suddenly self-conscious. He wiped his mouth with his sleeve and whispered, "Thank you," so softly it almost disappeared into the crackle of the fire. Night settled fully around the cabin, pressing close to the windows, but it couldn't touch the warmth inside. The woman slept, her breathing deep and uneven, the lines of pain easing from her face for the first time in days. The boy fought sleep with all his might, afraid that if he closed his eyes, everything would vanish when he opened them again. He watched the cowboy feed another log into the fire, the flames dancing across the scar on his jaw, and finally asked the question that had been burning in him since the plains. "Why did you stop?" The cowboy paused, his hand resting on the mantel. For a long moment he didn't answer. When he did, his voice was quieter than before. "'Cause once, a long time ago," he said, "someone didn't stop for me." The boy absorbed this, the weight of it settling somewhere deep in his chest. He nodded as if it made perfect sense. The cowboy cleared his throat and straightened. "You can sleep on the floor," he added, gesturing to a pile of blankets. "I'll take the chair." The boy shook his head immediately. "No," he said more firmly than he felt. "You need it." The cowboy almost smiled. Almost. He spread the blankets anyway, laying them near the bed so the boy would be close to his mother, and watched as the child curled up, exhaustion finally winning. Within minutes, his breathing evened out, small hands clutching the edge of the coat like an... The cowboy remained awake long after, sitting in the chair, listening to the sounds of the cabin, the fire, the wind, the faint breathing of 2 lives that had nearly slipped away. He knew better than to believe this was the end of their trouble. Morning would bring questions, choices, and dangers of its own. But for now, in this fragile pocket of warmth and light, they had survived the night. And sometimes, he thought, that was the hardest part of all.